Iceland. Jag vill lära att tala isländska, but I don't really speak Icelandic, so we'll do this mostly in English. So I work for an organization called the International Arctic Science Committee. The very short version of the next little while is that we help connect Arctic researchers between different countries and between different disciplines. That's the entire purpose of our organization. And I'm here in Iceland because right now Rannis, the Icelandic Center for Research, is sponsoring our office. And so I'm here for a little while. And so I'll tell you a little bit about, in general, the goals of what IASC does, how IASC works, and then a couple of the projects that we are working on. And I really want you to feel free to stop me along the way. If you have questions, you think things are particularly interesting, if you very obviously fall asleep in particular sections, I'll move through those really quickly. But really, if you have questions, please do stop me along the way. I'd love to make this as interactive as possible. And I guess I should say, with a little bit of, before I go into all of the IASC stuff, a little bit about my background. As you can probably hear from my accent, I'm American. I'm from just outside of Boston originally, but I've been living in Akureyri for, we'll say, just under 3 years, working for IASC there. So we have a little bit of an Arctic hub in Akureyri. So there's us, there's the Icelandic Arctic Cooperation Network, or Norðurslóðanetið. That's an example of a word that I have a really hard time saying in Icelandic, which is ironic, given my job. There's also 2 of the Arctic Council working groups based in Akureyri, the Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment, PAIM, or CAF, the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna. And then there's also the focus within the university on the polar law program there, and also some of the kind of other Arctic adjacent things like fisheries management and other stuff. So we like to talk about it as Arctic Akureyri a little bit. So that's why I'm up in Akureyri. My background is as a glaciologist, so I come at this from the natural sciences side of things. Cool. I'm hoping this works. Great. So this is the very formal thing, our mission statement that says IASC is a non-governmental international science organization. So we're sponsored by Iceland, but not an Icelandic organization as such. The mission of IASC is to encourage and facilitate cooperation in all aspects of Arctic research, in all countries engaged in Arctic research, and in all areas of the Arctic region. So, long story short, if you're doing Arctic research anywhere in the world, we want you to be able to connect to the IASC community. And so we do that by promoting and supporting leading edge, multi or interdisciplinary research with the goal to better understand the Arctic region and how it connects to the rest of the world. So, we've been around since 1990, so IASC is almost 30. No worries. And so we were the first international organization actually focused on the Arctic. And I emphasize that point because some people who are particularly interested in diplomacy or policy, the Arctic is really politically popular right now, but a lot of that political interest started around a scientific and shared interest. And so we try and provide a model for science cooperation in the North. To work on those goals that we said of connecting Arctic researchers and also making Arctic science more accessible to others, we initiate or coordinate activities. So a lot of research follows disciplinary boundaries or follows national boundaries because that's where research funding comes from. Or it might be cooperation with particular parts of industry that often work in certain countries. So what IASC does is a lot of it is helping sponsor small meetings and workshops that get researchers together from different disciplines or from different countries. And I'll give a few examples of that later on. And so we'll also serve as a kind of provider of advice to people looking for the state of knowledge in the Arctic. And we generally do that through the Arctic Council, which I'll talk about as well. but also working on assessment reports and things like that. And then a little bit of communicating scientific information to the public, and we sponsor some projects that do that as well. I'll mention it a little bit later, but one project we worked on, or gave some money to, is this project called Frozen Ground Cartoons. This is a group of permafrost scientists who wanted to communicate their work to the general public, and they put together essentially a little comic book about permafrost, and so we helped provide some money to get it translated and published into additional languages, but this is the English version. And I should have mentioned earlier on, I have a whole bunch of printed materials if you want to take things later to find out more about IASC, and if you're listening online, it's all on our website at iasc.info.
So just one question for
Yeah.
This cartoon, for example, is that available as a PDF file on your website?
It's not, it is available as a PDF. It's not on our website, but if you Google Frozen Ground Cartoons, then it should be available.
Okay.
Yes. And they're working on another kind of second version of it right now that is, it's an app. And I don't know exactly how that's working, but they're doing a kind of another level of it. Yeah. So a little bit of background on IASC. I didn't mention this before. We have 23 member countries. So who knows how many countries are in the Arctic? Any guesses? I can see some counting fingers. That's a good start. Any guesses? Throw something out.
Very quick issue.
Much less than 23.
That's the goal we're going for here. Yes, a lot fewer than 23. So there are 8 countries in the Arctic. Oh, you should have said it.
I say it?
Even right there. So it's the U.S. and Canada in North America, and then we have Iceland, thanks to Grimsey, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. That's the Arctic 8. But that means we have 15 other countries that are also interested in Arctic science. All around, I would say all around the world, but really all around the northern hemisphere. So there are a lot of countries with people focusing on Arctic science. And that's mostly because this is a very overused phrase, but what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, right? Our atmospheres are connected, our ocean is connected, our transportation systems, people, right? Like the Arctic is not insulated from the rest of the world, and so even if you're living a lot further south, it's important to be able to understand Arctic systems, whether that's changes in weather patterns, whether it's more interest in global climate change, ecosystem change. There have been a few recent projects, say, focusing on migratory birds, right? So a lot of the birds that spend the summer in Iceland spend the winter in other countries further south. So that's why there are a lot more countries interested in Arctic science than just the 8 Arctic nations.
Excuse me, did you say Greenland?
Thank you. I forgot to say one. Denmark.
Yes.
So the Kingdom of Denmark, including Greenland. Thank you. Oh, that's embarrassing. Good catch. I mean, that was entirely intentional, and you passed the test. Yeah. Thank you. That would have been really bad. So we do have engagement in Greenland, technically through the Kingdom of Denmark. Yes. So in terms of projects that we funded in the last year, we funded 23 projects in the 2018 fiscal year. So that went through the beginning of this year. The way our organization works, or IASC works, is that the countries nominate experts to scientific working groups. And that's our atmosphere, cryosphere, marine, social and human, and terrestrial. And so these groups are intentionally not too disciplinary. Right, so imagine that you study snow. Like say you're a snow scientist. You might be in the cryosphere working group because snow is frozen, but you also might be in the atmosphere because it has to do with meteorology or prediction, or you might be in terrestrial because you're interested in what happens after the snow falls. So that's a good example of intentionally we have these broad groups so that scientists from different disciplines talk with each other. And so each of our countries nominates experts to these working groups, up to 2 per country. And they're the ones that determine which scientific projects IASC supports, which priorities do get moved forward. So I know it's a little process-based, but hopefully helps you also understand a little bit of how countries actually make that transition from science coordination all the way to the kind of broad diplomatic side of things. I was going to say something else and I forgot about that. Well, we'll come back to it. So that means we have 170 scientific working group members, and we also have 2 action groups going on for the short-term projects. Working groups exist long-term. We have a few short-term projects going on right now. One specifically focused on Indigenous involvement, that's looking at recommendations for IASC on how to better involve Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledge into the science that IASC supports. And then one on bylaws, which is super exciting, but has more to do with we're a 30-year-old organization and making sure we just codify some of our processes. So this is a map of the Arctic. I realize I'm standing right in front of it, so it's probably a little hard for you to see it. Sorry. And so we're here in northern Iceland. The dark countries are all of the IASC member countries. So we said those 23 member countries are really far, everywhere from as far south as India, Spain, Portugal, Italy, right? Not just countries that are up north. Yeah. And I mentioned this before, but we work with policymakers through the Arctic Council. And so that's an intergovernmental forum to raise issues around the Arctic, largely focuses on environmental protection and sustainable development in the Arctic. We're an observer to that body, which means that we can contribute to projects that they're working on, usually, again, providing suggestions for experts to engage on projects that they're working on or work on kind of state of the science reports. So an example of that going on right now is that they're working on the chairmanship of the Arctic Council is in Iceland right now. There's a brochure about that if you're interested. But they're working on a project on marine litter and plastics in the ocean. And so they are putting together the state of knowledge on that. And so one thing that we did to contribute to it is say, oh wait, here's some more experts that you haven't engaged in this process yet, but know a lot about that topic. Here they are, and we can connect you to that group, and then also provide some guidance in planning a conference and building a kind of report on this is what we do know, this is what we don't know, and this is what scientists need to know more. We're also a part of the International Science Council, which is more about, it's a group of scientific organizations all around the world. So we focus specifically on the Arctic, and there are a lot of other different science organizations that do similar stuff, but not just in the Arctic. So we try and learn from each other. One of the things we focus on in particular is supporting early career scientists. And so a focus of IASC is helping early career scientists build networks between countries and disciplines as well. So this map is showing you all of the connections, travel for early career scientists that we supported last fiscal year. And so over 150 people using something like 40% of our scientific budget. And since, yeah.
How big the proportion is the social science workers? Is it only natural science or is it also social sciences?
Yeah, that's a great question. So
tourism studies for that sake.
Yeah. So IASC basically we call ourselves science, but really it's any research in the Arctic. And so we have this social and human working group, which tourism and social sciences definitely fits within. But there have been some other projects we've supported that have been interested in kind of connections between, say, tourism and environmental impact, things that cross that social and natural sciences divide. One challenge that we do have with the structure is that social and humans is so broad. It's absolutely huge. Like it could be economics, it could be human health, it could be tourism, right? There's so many things that fit within that. And so that's something that we do struggle with as well. And so trying to emphasize those connections with other disciplines, but also just connections within that group, right? it's so broad even within itself. So you can tell from the structure that it started historically as focusing more on the natural and physical sciences, and has been expanding more and more into focusing on all of the research that's happening in the Arctic, which also kind of goes along with a broader transition from focusing just on purely, if you will, academic research, just exploratory sort of research, towards more use-inspired type research. I wouldn't say societally driven might be a better way of phrasing that. And it's really hard to know how to benefit society without having social science along there at the same time. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yeah. So if you're kind of a structurally minded person, here's a diagram of some of what I was talking about before. We have our central leadership in the middle, central leadership, and then our working groups focus on our scientific topics. We have our action groups that focus on the kind of 1 to 2 year timescale projects, and then we have our implementation, so all of the stuff that gets supported, whether that's workshops, assessment reports, small activities, science planning, I'll mention a little bit later, as well as longer term programs. Yeah. Cool. The leadership of our organization, again, comes from our 23 member countries. Each of the countries nominates one senior scientist or leader within the Arctic research community to sit on our council, which is our leadership body. One thing which this photo also makes a good time to mention is our lack of diversity within a lot of our working groups and within our leadership right now. So what we started doing in recent years is, as a basic start, providing the statistics of what our, especially what our gender breakdown is within our groups, and making sure that all of our member countries know that when they nominate new people. So we don't, as an organization, we can't require what our member countries, who they nominate to be part of our working groups in our council. But we can tell them that our council has 23 people on it and only 3 of them are women, and maybe you should think about providing some balance there. Things like that. And then within our, I'll mention this a little later, but within our early career program for our fellows, for example, we can say, we can have control over that and say, yes, it'll be 50-50, things like that. This is our secretariat. So there's me up here in the left hand. I know it's really small text. This information is all on our website. The point of this is that while it looks like a really big organization, the only full-time person on this entire slide is me. And then we have Hjalti, who is half-time, working for us in Akureyri with a lot of the kind of financial management side of stuff. Federica is also in Akureyri, and she's our communications manager. She works a quarter time for IASC. And then everyone else on this list is there as a volunteer. And so we have early career scientists, usually postdocs, that will help as our working group secretaries. So the people the countries nominate to be part of these groups are usually kind of mid-career type people. And so the earlier career people get an opportunity to kind of be part of the group and volunteer to help with meeting organization, taking notes, that sort of stuff. In return, we pay for them to be at the meetings, but they volunteer their time. And so we thank them a lot for that. Like I said, Rannis is currently hosting the Secretariat in Akureyri and has been doing so since January 2017, and will keep doing so for the next 5 years at least. Sorry, 5 years from there at least. I shouldn't make any promises that I can't commit to. Yeah, I mentioned before, the working groups are the home of where our science happens, right? They are the scientific experts within IASC. And more than that, they're also the connectors to the scientific communities in their home countries as well. So we hope that they're a bit of a node for connecting the Arctic science community. Out of the working groups comes our scientific plans, comes the advice, and really, again, comes a network of Arctic scientists. And so whether that's to continue the example I gave before on plastics and ocean litter, I email out to our working groups to say, hey, are any of you experts on this topic? And do you know other experts on these topics? So we're not just limiting it to a relatively small group of 170 experts, but really trying to network with as many Arctic scientists around the world as we can. So we ask that those experts are nominated not just for their expertise, but also for their connections to their community as well. And in some countries, that's relatively easy. Iceland, not a huge country, fairly well networked. Somewhere like Russia, it's a lot harder, right? They have the same number of experts on our working groups as Iceland does, but huge country, not necessarily as well connected. And so, presents a really big challenge for the bigger research countries as well. So in terms of the expertise, we get a few keywords from each of our working group members, just to know what their areas of focus are. And we throw those all into a word cloud to see where it focuses on. The good thing is that Arctic is really big. It definitely should be. What are you noticing?
We don't see tourism. We see
That's-
snow.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the first you saw.
So I think some of the things that really show up large are the interdisciplinary topics, like climate change. Snow is a kind of thing at the interface. Sea, because whether that's sea ice or other sorts of ocean interactions is big. I'm surprised glacier and glaciers are quite as big as they are. And then things like ecology, ecosystem, policy, carbon. But you're right, that there isn't a huge tourism focus within our social and human working group. I brought a few of our annual reports, which also have lists of our working group members and their expertise, so we should take a look at that afterwards and see who is or who isn't.
But it's also interesting, you also don't have much economics,
No.
which I would think would be a big part there of the natural resource use or not
There's
use.
economics right under budget.
There's a little economic,
At least on
but
the-
it's not huge. I mean, ozone is bigger than economic.
But is there you talk about this is founded in 1990.
Mm-hmm.
So if you had a work cloud from 1990 and 2000, 2010 and now, would you see a big change in some of these
That's
terms of what you look at?
That's a great question. I think we would.
Mm-hmm.
There's definitely been more of a focus of moving towards more societally relevant research as opposed to just exploratory research. So exactly what that would mean in terms of this word cloud, I don't know. I think that things like focusing climate would probably still be really big, but climate change would not be, I would guess, for example.
So there is a trend towards including society
Yes.
and nature together more and more, I guess.
Yeah, I'd say there are definitely trends towards societally relevant research as well as more involvement of local and indigenous peoples in the Arctic. One of the projects that IASC supports every decade is called the International Conference on Arctic Research Planning, which is more than, it started out as just a conference and has moved more towards a year-long process around consultation of priorities in Arctic research. I have the most recent report, which was from 4 years ago now, so I'll be ramping up to the next one. But some of the topics that showed up there that weren't in previous reports were specifically around local and indigenous engagement as well. Yeah. So in addition to those working groups, we also have a group called the International Science Initiative in the Russian Arctic. I gave the Russian example before, kind of intentionally. It's a large area that is, if we're going to understand Arctic ecosystems and the Arctic in general, we need to understand Russia. But it's huge. And so we have a group specifically focused on connecting researchers who are working in the Russian Arctic, both domestically and internationally. And so the idea is to help them, give them a little more extra help in planning large international or interdisciplinary projects, providing a forum for connecting with researchers, and then also helping with issues that are unique to working in the Russian Arctic, whether that's focusing on permitting, whether it's suggestions on like language, things like that. And a little bit of funding to help with that as well. We have a fellows program I mentioned briefly before that focuses on getting a couple early career scientists involved in the work of our working groups. And so the idea there is that they get a little bit of insight into how international projects get off the ground, and we encourage them to suggest projects of their own as well. So they get funding to come to our big annual meeting for 2 years, and then we hope that they take on a leadership role in an activity in year 3. One of the other projects underneath IASC is an organization called Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks. So it's often described as a network of networks, but basically, the idea is to connect people who are planning where we observe and monitor in the Arctic, right? That we can do a lot more with our observations. Say, if you know that your colleagues, you're interested in studying, here's a good example, you're interested in studying terrestrial ecology. You want to know what plants are growing where, what small animals are around, and so there's a research station near Raufarhöfn that is doing that sort of monitoring here in Iceland, in northeast Iceland. But wouldn't it be even better if you knew that your colleagues in Greenland and in North America were doing similar measurements? It would be really frustrating if they were doing like mostly similar, but just a little bit different, right? So you're like, oh, well, we can almost work together, but not quite. And so SAON is an example of a venue where you can get people who are planning those monitoring programs to talk to each other who actually are doing the same things together, so that the researchers in Iceland and in northern Canada and in Greenland can all pool their data together and learn more by not just studying their area, but how it relates to either changes or not in other areas of the Arctic. So that's a very specific example. SAON is also focused on the broader things, whether it's like general weather observations, satellite observations, providing a venue for people to talk about also how they either prioritize or motivate certain observations. So doing monitoring, not cheap, not easy to motivate necessarily, but is it because you're providing certain social benefits? Is it that there are recognized economic benefits? Things like that. For people who are planning those sorts of systems to also connect with each other.
Do you know if they're using these networks to observe impact from cruise ships in the Arctic?
That's a great question. I have not heard of monitoring specifically around cruise ship impact. The topic that more often comes up for discussion is whether we can use cruise ships, in particular expedition cruises, to observe rarely visited areas. But the conversation definitely goes both ways. I've heard of individual municipalities like Seyðisfjörður doing some atmospheric observations to see if air quality is being impacted, but I haven't heard of any coordinated studies on cruise ship impacts.
Because, for example, I met someone from Norway a couple of weeks ago where they are trying to focus on reducing the impact on cruise ships in the narrow fjords there. In some of the bigger areas like Bergen and so on. But they find it quite difficult because they can't do it alone. They have to be, has to be pressure for example, from Reykjavik or Akureyri or other areas with cruise ships. So even if the big rich country, it's quite difficult to impact on cruise ships. And from some scientific work, we know the impact on land or on the cities. I'm not sure about if we know enough about the impact while we're cruising. If there is impact there, is it more while on land? So in that case, they're isolated and they can't have pressure to create change. But I wonder also maybe if they have this kind of network to get the data, then it might be easier to create that kind of you could call it pressure or cooperation.
Yeah, for sure. And I know a lot of what this group has focused on has not been so much more looking at the impacts of particular industries or anything like that, that has been more focused on, I guess, baseline environmental monitoring and things like that.
But that baseline could be used.
It could be if it's in the right places
Yeah.
and if it's the right indicators. Exactly. Yeah. There were two studies in the last couple of years. One was led by the EU. The acronym was IMOBAR, IMOBAR, which was more on the economic benefits of Arctic monitoring. And so that has been increasingly used as kind of a business case for why we should be doing more monitoring in the Arctic. And that was partly based on another study the year before, which was looking at societal benefits. And so a lot of the conversation has been framed more around societal benefits than anything else, rather than the compliance side of things, I guess. Yeah. But AMAP, the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, is another working group of the Arctic Council, and definitely does more of the assessments and pulling together knowledge, especially around long-term change and contamination and things like that. Yeah. Another group within IASC that is partly IASC, partly SEAN, is this group called the Arctic Data Committee. They exist to help us share data with each other, basically. Long story short, and making sure that we know how we're organizing our data, organize data policies to make data accessible and interoperable and open to each other, and we know where it came from and what's happened to it, and things like that. One of the projects that they're working on right now is something called federated search, which is a very jargony thing, but it essentially is saying we know that our data is all over the place, but making sure that it's cataloged in such a way so that if I look for data in my favorite data repository, that it can easily call upon data in a lot of other places. And so think of it like Google, but for Arctic data in particular. If you're interested in data in particular, there's a polar data forum that's happening in Helsinki in October or November this year. So the other very, I guess, tangible thing that IASC does every year is organize the Arctic Science Summit Week. And so that's an annual conference that we convene, held in a different place around the world each year, that helps bring together the Arctic science community. And the idea is that there are lots of these smaller organizational meetings that are happening, and we can both save on time, money, carbon, by having these small meetings all together in one place each year. And the one that I'll just, before I even describe any more about it, I'll say that it will be in Akureyri next year, in March and April. And so every other year, it's also a venue for a large Arctic Science Conference. And then alternating between that is the Arctic Observing Summit, which is more workshop focused and more talking about, again, where are we making observations, where do we need to be, things like that. So this year is going to be in 2020, and Akureyri is an Arctic Observing Summit year. But the first half of it, sometimes we call them business meetings, sometimes we call them community meetings, but essentially anyone within the Arctic science community can say, hey, I'd like to have a research meeting or a workshop or something like that. It'll be this many people, I need this much space, and can we do that? And then we try and schedule those all together.
Within this week.
Yeah, exactly. So it'll be at the end of March, beginning of April next year. This is also when all of our scientific working groups meet and things like that. So if you're interested in the work of a particular one of those groups, those meetings are mostly open as well. This year, so there's more information at ASSW2020.is. Though it might be under construction right now, but there will be more information there. At the beginning of ASSW this year, there will also be what we're calling an International Science Day that is focused around dialogue between policymakers and scientists. And so there are going to be some Arctic Council meetings in Akureyri, immediately before. So we're hoping to get some of those people to stay and talk about how their decisions get shaped or influenced by the state of scientific knowledge, or how research can be framed to better feed into the policy making or decision making. Yeah. And if you're looking for more of a reason to not just go to Akureyri, no matter how convenient it might be, the next year in 2021, there will be a bigger science conference, and that'll be in Lisbon, Portugal. If getting to Portugal in March sounds like a good idea to you.
Mm-hmm.
And the year after that will be up in Tromsø, so we move around.
I was wondering,
Yeah.
for the Arctic Science Something in Akureyri,
Yeah.
who should we contact if we would like to check out?
Yeah. You can start by asking me. We have a conference organizer, Federica Scarpa, so the person who also works for our communications management. If you go onto the IASC website, you can find more information there. And so depending on how you're interested in getting involved, there will be more information when all of the community meetings are scheduled and that sort of thing. That'll be made available online. I know that we will also have a small team of volunteers helping out with some of the sessions along the way. Yeah, thanks. This is a long list of the partners that we work with, and I intentionally put it right after ASSW because a lot of them have annual meetings at Arctic Science Summit Week as well. So organizations like the Forum of Arctic Research Operators, so the people who help support science in the Arctic from lots of different countries will meet. The International Association for Cryospheric Sciences or Permafrost Science Association, the Pacific Arctic Group, these kind of regional or disciplinary bodies will also meet sometimes at ASSW. The other organization, which I'm sure you've heard of, IASA, the International Arctic Social Sciences Association, works most closely with our social and human working group, but definitely there's a lot more focus on tourism within that organization as well. And I mentioned them in particular because we were asking about tourism. And the University of the Arctic also has a strong thematic network focused on tourism in the Arctic. And I know that they're going to be hosting their U-Arctic Congress in Reykjavik next October. And some people are already talking about tourism sessions there. Yeah. So the other way to find out more about IASC is through our wonderful communications, and that could just be going to the IASC website. But probably more of interest is we have a monthly newsletter that comes out on the IASC email list. So if you go to IASC.info and scroll to the bottom, there's a little link to sign up on our email list. And so more information about ASSW or anything else will be coming out there. Cool. So I know I've been rambling for a while and about a lot of the generalities of things. And so I'll give a few examples of some projects that we've helped support and how we link a little bit more with policy before I wrap up. So IASC has been an observer, I mentioned, to the Arctic Council since the Arctic Council formed. IASC was formed in 1990, and we initially started especially focusing on things like assessment reports, like the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, which came out in 2004-2005, helping with planning around the International Polar Year, engaging on discussions of like what comes after the International Polar Year. In case the IPY, International Polar Year, was a couple of years, 2007 to 2009, where many countries all around the world said we are going to spend more time and money studying the polar regions for this condensed period of time, and all do it at the same time, working together to make the most of all of our science happening. So a lot of the reason of doing that is you have to know enough about a subject to ask a research question, right? But we don't know what we don't know. So if you, for example, don't know that glaciers, this is my very particular example, but you don't know that glaciers actually change on like monthly seasonal timescales, well then you wouldn't think to look for that because they don't really look like they're moving very quickly and they just kind of stay there frozen until you study them more intensely and realize that they don't. So a lot of what the International Polar Year was about was learning more about those things that we don't know about. It was a lot of that exploratory research. And so figuring out what to do with all of that new knowledge moving forward. So IASC has also been contributing on an Arctic Council convened project on enhancing international Arctic scientific cooperation. And there is an internationally binding treaty on that topic that says basically we have to help Arctic scientists working with each other between different countries, which is really exciting. And then I mentioned before, also have convened this international conference on Arctic research planning every 10 years or so within IASC. So that, this is, oh wow, really hard to see right now, but the ICARP report, as we call it, focused on what the international science community said should be the priorities in Arctic research. Every country might have their own priorities, but this is the overall international priorities. The three kind of overarching topics were the role of the Arctic in the global system, observing and predicting future climate dynamics and ecosystem responses, and understanding the vulnerability and resilience of Arctic environments and societies, and supporting sustainable development. There's a lot that fits under those topics, and a lot more that's within the report itself. These are like the three top-line things from a year-long process of talking about what the priorities of Arctic research are. So I have a couple copies here, and it's all available online as well. In terms of the priorities that IASC has, we try and build on top of those ICARP 3 priorities. We love acronyms. So we tried to build on those priorities, but with more specific goals in particular. And so each of our working groups identifies some of those goals. This is the very long list of small text on the right-hand side that is actually available in our strategic plan. Again, I have copies here, or there's more on the IASC website. And so it might be fairly broad things, like what do ecosystems do with when sea ice changes? You know, something more at that level of it's both a broad question, but somewhat more focused than just what do we do when sea ice changes, right? So yeah, that's all available on IASC website. Unless anyone really wants me to drill into the topics of the strategic plan, I figured I can probably move past that. Yeah, okay. Cool. I mentioned before that we try and connect researchers between different disciplines and between different countries. So in particular, we're excited about this international agreement on enhancing scientific cooperation in the Arctic. I always forget what the official order is, but it's exciting that it's an international agreement, was signed by foreign ministers from all of these countries that says that that legally we help Arctic scientists working with each other. Exactly what that means in terms of implementation, we don't know yet. So we're still exploring that side of things. And the next.
I was going to ask about money.
Yeah. What about money? Yeah. The agreement is fairly explicit about this having no financial implications, unfortunately, and not requiring any increased financial expenditures. In terms of IASC's money, we're a fairly, shall we say, low-budget organization. Each country contributes around 15,000 euro, slightly more for bigger countries, slightly less for smaller countries. And that's the money that then gets redistributed to support our fellows program and support the activities that the working groups choose to support. And so anyone can submit a proposal to the working groups. And this happens every year that says, I'm interested in this topic, and there are we have a little rubric that gets used for assessment, and that's, we prioritize interdisciplinary projects, we prioritize pan-Arctic as opposed to just regional projects, things like that, and we prioritize projects that align with the scientific priorities called out in the ICARP strategy. And then this is not money to do research, but it's money to get researchers talking with each other, right? Exactly. So we're talking on the scale of like 10,000 euro per project, something like that. So nothing huge, but usually it's people who are either at the seed stage, like, ooh, we think this is an idea, and we each want to put in our own proposals, but we need to get in the same place to talk about that, supporting something like that, or later on when a bunch of groups might be focusing on a particular topic, haven't been talking with each other, but they're going through their research and like, oh wait, we should be working with each other much better than we are. So different types of projects that get supported that way. A few examples of projects. That's a perfectly timed question. Nice. One project which we're really proud to say came out of IASC initially is this project called Mosaic, the Multidisciplinary Drifting Observatory for the Study of Arctic Climate. It is the single largest Arctic expedition that has ever occurred. And you might have heard about it recently. You might hear more about it because I want to say it's 3 days. It might be 2 days. It might be 4. An icebreaker, a German icebreaker, the Polar Stern, is going to be launching from Tromsø, Norway. It will be going across Russia, northern Russia, until it finds a nice ice floe that they like on the eastern side of Russia, where it will get frozen in for the winter. And over the course of the next year, it will drift over the entire Arctic as a kind of base, as a research base, to be drifting over the Arctic over the course of the winter until it comes out the other side next year. And the idea is we don't know what happens in a lot of these systems over the winter, right? To say it's cold and dark is an understatement, but we'll just go with it's cold and dark. And we don't know what all of these different systems, how they interact. Like what happens with the biology under the ice? What happens with the ice-atmosphere interactions over the course of the year? And so the idea is this project will study all of those over the course of an entire year. And what's really cool is that, so it's a German icebreaker, but they can't just freeze in. They don't have everything for the course of an entire year on the ship. And so they'll be supported by a few different icebreakers, I think definitely some planes, maybe a helicopter or two, I don't really know, over the course of the year, right? So a Swedish icebreaker will help them at one point, definitely a few Russians. The Chinese icebreaker will be providing support at one stage as well. And there are all sorts of different scientists on board from a whole bunch of different countries as well. And so this idea initially came out of a workshop within IASC to say, wait, how do we better understand what's happening in the Arctic? And then there have been more workshops that IASC has helped support either on particular topics or on planning the logistics and implementation, things like that. So this is a really good example of the type of thing that can come out of getting scientists together in the same room.
It is an awesome project.
Yeah.
It's so cool.
It's really cool.
As well as the acronym.
Mosaic? Yeah. They
Really
did a
great.
good job. It's really nerdy. And it's great. They also have a great communications team. So there is a Mosaic website where you can see where the ship is right now and talks more about the individual projects that are happening on board. It's not just scientists that will be there. There will be journalists on different legs. So there are 4 or 5 legs so that no one, if anyone, is actually staying on board the ship for the whole time. They're when they get new supplies, they're also exchanging people along the way.
And they're starting soon, you said.
Yeah. So the first leg is going to be actually done as a bit of a training course for early career scientists. So as they go from the initial, when they leave Tromsø, Norway, the first leg will be education, and then they'll leave when the main first big research leg starts. And then other projects have come out of this, that a lot of the terrestrial community was like, well, but they get this big, awesome expedition, and what do we get? And they're like, well, hold on. If they have overwinter observations happening, there's a group of scientists who have started a project called T-Mosaic, or Terrestrial Mosaic, focusing on, well, what are the connections between the Central Arctic and coastal areas in particular, and trying to use this special suite of observations to inform what we can study around the edge of the Arctic at the same time. Another example is one called PACES, which is Air Pollution in the Arctic, Climate, Environment, and Societies. I said before, we love acronyms. Sometimes they're more of a stretch than others. This project in particular was interested in looking at air pollution and what it means for, well, where it's coming from, what's happening to it, and who's affected by it. And very much as an interdisciplinary approach, because it's taking experts, say, in atmospheric chemistry, but also getting them to talk with people who might be health experts, for example, to look at especially the impact side of things. They've been focusing in particular on the area around Fairbanks, Alaska, and one community in Russia, whose name I am forgetting right now, to look at different sources of air pollution, but also the effects of it in those areas. And that's not just us, but also working with the International Global Atmospheric Chemistry Organization as well. I mentioned before the frozen ground cartoon, so sometimes it's getting researchers together, sometimes we support projects that get science out there. So this is the cartoon focused on permafrost, in ideally making permafrost science fun and more accessible. They're expanding it into an app focused on augmented reality. And the idea is also to humanize the face of science as well. You know, we don't just look like Albert Einstein with crazy hair. Some of us don't have hair. And more importantly, that it's a much more diverse group of people than you might traditionally think of. The Network on Arctic Glaciology is another example of a project that is more about getting different disciplines together. So it's focused around glaciers, but recent projects, for example, have focused on getting glaciologists and oceanographers together to talk about how ice and ocean interact. We're also getting ecologists in there. There's lots of runoff coming off of these glaciers, going in either overland or into the ocean. What does that mean for the local ecosystems, for example? So that's my spiel. You can find out, again, more at www.iasc.info, or ask me lots of questions now. Stop by our office in Akureyri anytime you like. And I hope this gave you a little bit of a window into how Arctic scientists, or how we can help Arctic scientists work with each other even more.